What if the most condemned man in the history of Western civilization was not a traitor, not a misunderstood traitor, not a traitor with complicated motivations that deserve our empathy before our condemnation, not a traitor whose betrayal can be contextualized within the political pressures of first-century Judea in ways that make him more sympathetic without changing what he fundamentally was? What if he was not a traitor at all? What if the man whose name became the definition of betrayal, whose 30 pieces of silver became the universal symbol of selling out the people who trusted you, whose kiss became the most infamous gesture in the history of human intimacy, whose very name became an insult that 20 centuries of every language in the Western world still use when they want to describe someone who chose personal gain over loyalty to everything that mattered? What if that man did exactly what he was asked to do? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not the kind of revisionist speculation that the internet produces in industrial quantities and that dissolves under the first contact with actual historical evidence. What I am about to show you is a document, a physical document written in the 2nd century AD, found in the Egyptian desert in 1978, purchased by the National Geographic Society, translated by scholars from Oxford and Harvard, and published to the world in 2006. A document that existed, that was real, that was read by communities of early Christians who believed it contained the true account of what happened between Jesus and the man history remembers as his betrayer. A document that the most powerful institution in the Western world spent 17 centuries trying to ensure you would never read. The question is not whether the document exists, it does. The question is not whether it is ancient, it is. The question, the one that has been building since 325 AD, when a Roman emperor convened a council that decided what you were, permitted to know about the origins of the faith that shaped your civilization, is what it means that it was buried. What it means that someone decided the world was safer without it, and what it reveals about the relationship between power, narrative, and the specific and very human cost of being the person who tells the version of the story that the institution cannot afford to let survive. That story begins 2,000 years ago, but it ends in your life, right now, today. Before we go any further, before we enter the full story of what was buried and why and what the burying cost, I need to stop here for a moment. Not because the story requires a pause, but because the people who are still here, who made it through those first words without clicking away, without deciding that a 2,000-year-old document found in an Egyptian desert is not relevant to their Tuesday, those people deserve to be acknowledged for what their presence here actually means. You are not here because you stumbled across a religious debate. You are here because something in the question landed. The question of what happens to truth when the institution that controls the narrative decides truth is inconvenient. The question of what it costs a person, or a community, or a civilization to carry the version of the story that power declared dangerous. The question of whether the most condemned figure in the history of Western culture was condemned for the right reasons or for the reasons that the people writing the condemnation needed him to be condemned. These are not ancient questions. You have lived versions of them. Every person who has ever watched an official narrative contradict what they personally witnessed has lived a version of them. Every person who has ever been in a room where the version of events that was recorded was not the version of events that occurred has lived a version of them. Every person who has ever understood that loyalty and reputation are not always pointing in the same direction and has had to choose between them has lived a version of what this story is about. If you have ever been in that position, if you have ever known something that the official version of events required you not to know, write in the comments right now, I know what was buried. Not as a theological statement, as a human one, as the acknowledgement of a person who recognizes in a story 2,000 years old something from their own experience that they have not previously had the language to name. Hit the like button now, because every like on this video is one more person who will encounter the question that 17 centuries of institutional power spent enormous resources preventing people from encountering. Every like matters in a way that goes beyond the algorithm. And if you are not yet subscribed to Mindmasters Academy, subscribe now and activate the bell. Because what is being built here is the only series on YouTube that connects Marcus Aurelius to Commodus to Caligula to Judas in a single unbroken conversation about power, narrative, and the gap between the official version of history and what actually happened. The series only makes complete sense to the people who have followed it from the beginning. And what comes after Judas, the next document, the next buried truth, the next figure that history condemned for reasons that history's authors needed rather than reasons that the evidence supports, is already waiting. The story of Judas begins not in Judea. It begins in a room in a city in what is now Turkey in the year 325 AD, where a Roman emperor sat down with 318 bishops and decided what you were allowed to know. The year is 325 AD, and the most important meeting in the history of Western civilization is about to begin. Not important in the way that battles are important. Battles change borders, redistribute resources, transfer the names on the documents that govern who owns what and who obeys whom. Important in a deeper and more permanent and more personally relevant way. Important in the way that decisions about what is true are always more important than decisions about who is powerful. Because power changes hands and borders move and empires fall. But the story that a civilization tells about its origins tends to outlast every political structure that emerged from those origins and shapes, every subsequent generation's understanding of what the world is and what their place in it means. The Emperor Constantine had unified the Roman Empire through military force and political calculation, and the specific ruthlessness of a man who understood that unity requires the elimination of alternatives. He had also, in the decade preceding the council, made a decision that would shape Western civilization more profoundly than any of his military victories. He had made Christianity the favored religion of the Roman state. Not the only religion, not yet, but favored in the specific and consequential way that imperial favor operates, with resources, with institutional support, with the implicit and then increasingly explicit understanding that the structures of Roman imperial power and the structures of the emerging Christian institutional church were going to develop a relationship of mutual reinforcement that would define the next 15 centuries of Western history. But Christianity in 325 AD was not the unified institutional religion that Constantine needed it to be for that relationship to function. It was a collection of communities distributed across the Mediterranean world, each with its own texts, its own traditions, its own understanding of who Jesus was and what his teaching meant, and how the story of his life and death should be understood by the people who organized their lives around his memory. Communities in Alexandria reading texts that the communities in Antioch had never heard of. Communities in Syria preserving accounts that the communities in Rome considered at best marginal and at worst dangerous. Communities in Egypt maintaining a relationship with the Jesus tradition that was organized around ideas about direct personal access to the divine, about the nature of knowledge and the nature of the sacred, about the relationship between institutional authority and individual spiritual experience, that were structurally incompatible with the kind of unified institutional church that the alliance between imperial power and organized religion required. This diversity was not, from a purely theological perspective, necessarily a problem. Traditions contain multitudes. The complexity of a tradition is often evidence of its vitality rather than its incoherence. But from the perspective of Constantine, who needed the Christian church to function as a unifying institutional force across the enormous and ethnically and culturally diverse territory of the Roman Empire, the diversity was a very specific and very practical problem. You cannot use a fragmented and internally contested institution as an instrument of imperial unity. You cannot ask people to organize their civic loyalty around a religious identity if that religious identity is itself the subject of unresolved and sometimes violent internal dispute. Before the church could serve the function that Constantine needed it to serve, it had to agree on what it was. The Council of Nicaea was the mechanism of that agreement. 318 bishops gathered in the city of Nicaea to vote on the questions that the Christian communities of the Roman world had been disputing. The primary question on the official agenda was theological, the Arian controversy, the precise nature of the relationship between Jesus and God, the question of whether the Son was co-eternal with the Father or was a created being, however exalted. This question mattered enormously to the bishops who had traveled from across the empire to debate it, and it matters to theologians today. But alongside the theological questions were the questions that the official record of the council tends to address less directly, and that the consequences of the council make impossible to ignore. The questions about which texts constituted the authorized record of Christian origins, which accounts of Jesus and his disciples and the events of his life and death were to be received as canonical, as the definitive, authoritative, institutionally sanctioned truth, and which were to be received as something else. Which documents were scripture and which documents were, to use the word that the institutional church developed for the purpose, heresy. The word heresy requires a moment of attention because it is doing an enormous amount of work in this story, and it is doing work that its ordinary modern usage tends to obscure. In contemporary usage, heresy means roughly wrong, a belief or a claim that departs from what the relevant authority considers correct. It implies error. It implies the kind of mistake that can in principle be corrected through education or argument or the presentation of better evidence. That is not what heresy meant in the institutional context that the Council of Nicaea was constructing. In that context, heresy did not mean incorrect. It meant dangerous, not dangerous in the abstract sense of a belief that might lead people astray in their spiritual lives, though that was the official framing. Dangerous in the specific and institutional sense of a set of ideas whose continued circulation threatened the coherence of the narrative that the alliance between Roman imperial power and organized Christianity had just invested enormous resources in constructing. And the unified narrative required specific things. It required a clear account of who Jesus was and what he taught. It required a clear account of the chain of authority that connected the institutional church of 325 AD to the events of first century Judea. It required, above all, a clear and unambiguous account of the cast of characters in the founding story. Who were the heroes? Who were the witnesses? Who were the faithful? And who were the traitors? And it required Judas to be the traitor. Not because the evidence for his treachery was unambiguous. The document found in the Egyptian desert in 1978 demonstrates that it was not unambiguous, that communities of early Christians had preserved a very different account. But because the institutional narrative needed a clear villain, needed the category of betrayal to be filled by a specific and named figure whose condemnation was so total and so permanent that the category itself became unavailable for application to the institution and its decisions. The council ended, the canon was established, the texts that were outside the canon were declared heretical. And the communities that had been reading those texts for generations were given a choice that was not entirely a choice. Surrender the documents to the institutional authorities who would destroy them, or face the consequences of continued possession of materials that the alliance between the Roman state and the Christian church had just declared dangerous. Most communities surrendered, most documents were destroyed, but not everyone surrendered. Some communities looked at what they had preserved, the texts that their teachers had given them, the documents that connected them to an understanding of the Jesus tradition that the council had just declared did not officially exist, and made a different calculation. They buried what they loved in limestone containers, in the desert that preserved everything, in the ground that the council could not reach and that 17 centuries of subsequent institutional consolidation could not disturb. And what they buried waited, with the specific and completely reliable patience of things that have been entrusted to the earth by people who understood that the earth keeps what is given to it. There is a village in Egypt called Al-Minya. It sits on the west bank of the Nile in the Upper Egyptian region that the ancient world called the Thebaid, a stretch of desert and river that has been continuously inhabited for 5,000 years, and that the specific combination of dry air and stable underground conditions has made into one of the most extraordinary natural archives that the human world possesses. The desert around Al-Minya does not decay things, it preserves them. Papyrus that would dissolve in the humidity of Rome or Alexandria survives for centuries in the dry ground of the Thebaid, with the calm indifference of a material that has simply stopped being subject to time. In 1978, a farmer working in the desert near Al-Minya found a limestone box. Inside the box, a collection of papyrus manuscripts bound in leather and wrapped in additional protective material. The whole assemblage in the specific condition of something placed with care rather than simply abandoned, placed by people who understood that they were preserving something and who had taken the deliberate steps that preservation required, who had looked at the fires that the institutional church was lighting across the Christian communities of the Roman world and decided that the ground was safer than surrender. The farmer did not know what he had found, not in the sense that mattered for what would happen next. He knew it was old. He knew it was potentially valuable. He knew that the market for ancient materials was real and accessible. What he did not know, what nobody who handled the document in the years that followed seemed to fully grasp until it was almost too late, was that inside the leather binding was one of the most significant textual discoveries of the 20th century. A document that the institutional church had spent 17 centuries trying to ensure would never be read. A document that communities of early Christians had hidden in the ground rather than surrender to the authorities who were collecting and destroying the texts that the Council of Nicaea had placed outside the boundaries of authorized knowledge. What was inside was the Gospel of Judas. It had survived, not by accident, by the specific and deliberate decision of human beings who had assessed the risk of preservation against the certainty of destruction and chosen preservation, who had trusted the desert with the thing they loved most, and the desert had honored that trust with the reliable fidelity of a material that does not burn and does not decay and does not forget. But the 30 years that followed the discovery were not the story of a document received with the reverence its survival deserved. The Gospel of Judas entered the antiquities market. It was handled by dealers in Cairo. It was offered to institutions and private collectors. It was stored in a bank vault in the United States for 16 years in conditions completely inadequate for a document of its age and fragility, conditions that allowed the papyrus to deteriorate more severely in 16 years than it had in 16 centuries in the Egyptian desert. The document that had survived the Council of Nicaea, the burning of the heretical libraries, the 17 centuries of institutional Christianity's consolidation of its version of the story, That document was damaged more by a New York bank vault than by all the forces that had tried to erase it. In 2000, the National Geographic Society acquired the document through a Swiss intermediary. 6 years of restoration, carbon-14 dating, linguistic analysis and translation by scholars from Oxford, Harvard, and the University of Claremont followed. In 2006, the Gospel of Judas was published to the world, and what it said, what the communities that buried it in the Egyptian desert had preserved at personal risk across 16 centuries, contradicted the most foundational narrative assumption of Western civilization with the specific and quiet authority of a primary source that is not arguing, but simply telling. What it told, and why 2,000 years of institutional power needed you to never hear it, is exactly where we are going next. The Gospel of Judas is not a long document. In its restored and translated form, it runs to approximately 26 pages, a relatively brief text by the standards of the canonical Gospels, compact in the way of something that was written to preserve a specific and focused account rather than to provide a comprehensive narrative of events. It does not tell the entire story of Jesus and his ministry. It does not attempt to compete with the canonical Gospels on the ground of breadth or completeness. It tells a particular story, a story about the specific relationship between Jesus and one specific disciple. And what it says about that relationship is the thing that the Council of Nicaea needed to ensure you would never read. The document opens with Jesus laughing at his disciples, not with them, at them. The disciples are praying and giving thanks over a meal, and Jesus looks at them and laughs. And when they ask him why he is laughing, he tells them directly, "You are not doing this because it is right. You are doing it because your God is not my God." This is the first indication that the Gospel of Judas is operating in a theological register that the canonical Gospels do not occupy, a register in which the other disciples are not the faithful inner circle of the Jesus movement, but people who have fundamentally misunderstood what the movement is and what it is for. Jesus then asks which of them knows him truly. The disciples offer various answers. None of them are correct. And then Judas speaks. Judas says, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm." And Jesus looks at Judas and says something that no canonical gospel contains, something that the institutional church spent 17 centuries ensuring would not be part of the story that Western civilization told about its own origins. Jesus tells Judas that he is different from the others, that he sees more clearly, that he is capable of something the others are not capable of. And then, across the subsequent sections of the document, in the private conversations between Jesus and Judas that constitute the Gospel's central narrative, Jesus tells Judas what it is that he alone is capable of. What the thing is that requires the specific and uncommon quality of understanding that Judas alone among the disciples possesses. He asks Judas to betray him, not in the language of the canonical account, not a transaction between Judas and the chief priests, not 30 pieces of silver, not the mercenary calculation of a man choosing personal gain over loyalty to his teacher. In the language of the Gospel of Judas, the act that history remembers as the ultimate betrayal is a request, a specific and personal request made by Jesus to the one disciple he trusted completely, the one disciple whose understanding of the situation was accurate enough and whose love was strong enough to do the thing that needed to be done. The theological framework in which this makes sense is Gnostic, the tradition that the Council of Nicaea declared heretical and that the subsequent centuries of institutional Christianity worked systematically to eliminate. In the Gnostic, understanding the physical world is a limitation, a constraint on the divine spark that exists within each human being and that seeks reunion with its source. The body is not the self. The death of the body is not the destruction of what matters. And the act of liberating the divine spark from its physical constraint is not a violence, but a service. In this framework, what Judas does is not a betrayal, it is a liberation. Jesus cannot complete what he came to complete while he remains in the body that the physical world has given him. Someone has to facilitate the transition. Someone has to perform the act that will look to everyone who does not understand the full context like the worst thing a person can do to the person they love most. Someone has to be willing to be remembered as the villain of the story in order for the story to reach its necessary conclusion. And Jesus chooses Judas for this role, not because Judas is the weakest or the most corrupt or the most susceptible to the temptation of 30 pieces of silver. He chooses Judas because Judas is the strongest, because Judas understands, because Judas is the only one among the disciples who loves him with sufficient completeness to do what love in this situation actually requires, rather than what love in this situation appears to require from the outside. The document ends before the betrayal itself occurs. It ends with Judas receiving the full teaching, receiving the full understanding of what he is being asked to do and why, and going to do it. Going to perform the act that will cost him everything: his reputation, his place in the community, his name, the meaning that his name will carry for every subsequent generation of the civilization that receives the canonical account rather than this one. Going to do exactly what he was asked, by the person he loved most, at the cost of being remembered as the person who loved least. Every story that an institution tells about its own origins needs a villain. Not because villains are inevitable features of human events, not because the people who write institutional histories are necessarily dishonest, but because the villain serves a structural function in the narrative that no other character can serve. The villain defines the boundary. The villain shows with the specific and legible clarity that only contrast produces what the institution is by showing what the institution is not. The villain is the person whose choices demonstrate the cost of choosing wrongly, and whose punishment demonstrates that the institution has the authority and the will to enforce the difference between right and wrong as the institution defines them. Without a villain, the institutional narrative loses its most powerful instrument of cohesion. It loses the ability to point at a specific and named person and say, "This is what betrayal looks like. This is what happens to those who choose against what we stand for." Judas was perfect for this function. He was, present. He was named. He was close enough to the center of the founding story to make his betrayal genuinely significant. A disciple who betrayed was proof that betrayal could come from inside, that the community needed to maintain vigilance, not just against the enemies outside its boundaries, but against the potential traitor within. That loyalty needed to be demonstrated continuously and unambiguously, because the alternative was Judas, and everyone knew what Judas had done and what Judas had received for doing it. This is the function that the canonical Judas serves, not primarily a historical figure whose actions are documented, a structural element of an institutional narrative whose primary purpose is to define the cost of disloyalty in terms specific enough and personal enough and permanent enough to function as a deterrent across every subsequent generation of the community the narrative shapes. And here is where the Gospel of Judas becomes not just theologically interesting, but philosophically urgent for anyone paying attention to how power operates in the world they actually inhabit. Because the pattern that the canonical Judas narrative establishes is not specific to early Christianity. It is one of the most reliably recurring patterns in the entire history of human institutions. Every organization that builds its identity around a founding story needs a traitor in that story. Every community that requires loyalty from its members needs a figure whose fate demonstrates what disloyalty costs. Every institution whose authority depends on the acceptance of its official narrative needs a category of person whose condemnation is so total and so permanent that questioning the narrative itself begins to feel like membership in that category. There is a word that the institutional church developed in the 4th century that deserves more attention than it typically receives in the popular understanding of early Christian history. The word is heresy. And the reason it deserves more attention is that its ordinary modern usage obscures something important about what the word was actually doing in the institutional context in which it was deployed. Heresy in the context of the post-Nicaea church did not primarily mean incorrect. It meant dangerous. Dangerous in the specific and institutional sense of a set of ideas whose continued circulation threatened the coherence of the narrative that the alliance between Roman imperial power and organized Christianity had just invested enormous resources in constructing. The tradition that the Council of Nicaea declared heretical and that the Gospel of Judas belongs to was Gnosticism. And what the Gnostics believed at its most fundamental level was something that the institutional church could not accommodate, not because it was obviously wrong, but because it was structurally incompatible with the kind of institution the church was becoming. The Gnostics believed in direct personal access to the divine, not mediated access. Not access organized through priests and sacraments, and the institutional hierarchy of a church whose authority derived from its claim to be the authorized channel between human beings and God. Direct access. The divine spark present within each individual human being, capable of direct encounter with the divine source from which it came, requiring no institutional intermediary to facilitate the encounter. Knowledge, gnosis, as the primary spiritual practice, not faith in the sense of acceptance of institutional authority, not obedience to the doctrinal structures that the council was constructing, but the direct, personal, experiential knowledge of the divine that each individual was capable of pursuing through their own spiritual practice. You do not need to be a theologian to understand why this was incompatible with the institutional church that Constantine and the bishops of Nicaea were building. An institution whose authority rests on its claim to be the necessary intermediary between human beings. And God cannot accommodate a theological tradition that tells those same human beings they do not need an intermediary. An institution that derives its power from the control of access to the sacred cannot coexist peacefully with a tradition that places the sacred inside every individual and tells them to look there rather than to the institution for the experience they are seeking. What was erased when Gnosticism was declared heretical was not simply a competing theological option. It was an entire way of thinking about the relationship between individual experience and institutional authority, between personal knowledge and official doctrine, between the divine as something encountered directly and the divine as something mediated by a structure that claims the exclusive right to facilitate the encounter. An epistemology was eliminated alongside the theology, and the elimination was so thorough and so sustained across so many centuries that most people alive today in the Western world have no idea that the tradition existed, let alone what it said or why the institution that erased it needed to erase it so completely. There is a thread that runs through every story this series has told. It runs beneath the surface of the specific historical events, beneath the meditations written in cold tents, beneath the arena performances and the renamed months, beneath the divine costumes and the horse consul and the corridor on the 24th of January. It runs beneath all of it as the single most consequential question that the history of human beings in positions of power has ever produced. Who controls the story? Marcus Aurelius understood this question with the specific and uncomfortable precision of a man who held more power than any individual human being should hold, and who spent his nights alone, asking himself whether the story he was telling about himself matched the person he actually was. His entire practice was organized around this question. The Meditations are the daily record of a man examining the gap between the official version of himself and the actual version, and choosing again and again to close that gap rather than widen it. Commodus understood the question differently, understood it as an instrument rather than an obligation. Renamed Rome, renamed himself, renamed the months, constructed through the systematic application of absolute power to the problem of narrative. Control, a version of reality in which the gap between the official story and the actual story had been forced closed, not by the internal work of honest self-examination, but by the external force of making everyone around him perform the acceptance of the official version. Caligula understood it as a compulsion. The divine costumes and the horse consul and the bridge across the bay were all, at their deepest level, attempts to force the narrative of his own identity to be true by making the world perform its acceptance. And then there is the Church of the 4th century, which understood the question with the comprehensive clarity of an institution that had just been given the resources of the Roman Empire and was in the process of using those resources to answer it permanently and definitively. The canonical Judas serves this institutional function with extraordinary efficiency. Every time someone in the Christian world heard the name Judas, they received a compressed and complete lesson in what betrayal looks like, what it costs, and what the community does to the person who commits it. And what the Gospel of Judas does to this mechanism is structural. It does not merely offer a different interpretation of who Judas was. It reveals that the mechanism exists. It makes visible the specific and institutional purpose that the canonical Judas narrative was serving. And once the mechanism is visible, it cannot be made invisible again. Once you have seen that the narrative was a choice, that the version of the story that shaped your civilization's understanding of loyalty and betrayal was constructed rather than simply discovered, you cannot unsee it. There is a specific kind of courage that history almost never records. Not the courage of battles, the physical bravery of people who face danger with their bodies. That courage is real, and it deserves the recognition that history has always given it. But it is legible, it is visible. It produces the kind of dramatic and documentable acts that historical records are designed to preserve. The courage that history almost never records is the courage of the person who preserves the document, who looks at the fires and the institutional power behind the fires and the imperial force behind the institutional power, who calculates the risk of keeping the thing they believe is true against the certainty of what happens if they are found keeping it, and decides that the ground is safer than surrender. That act has no audience. It produces no dramatic last words. It leaves no record of itself except the object it was designed to preserve. We do not know the names of the people who buried the Gospel of Judas. We do not know whether they were men or women, young or old, community leaders or ordinary members of a community that had been told to burn what they believed and had decided not to. We know only that they existed, that they made the choice, and that the choice worked. The communities of early Christians who preserved the Gnostic texts in the Egyptian desert were doing something with immediate and personal consequences. The institutional church's campaign against heretical texts in the 4th century was not a passive declaration of theological preference. It was an active enforcement operation backed by the resources of the Roman state, with real people performing real inspections of real communities and real consequences for real individuals who were found in possession of texts that the council had declared dangerous. The people who buried the Gospel of Judas knew this. They buried it because they knew this, because they understood that what they were preserving was sufficiently threatening to the official narrative, that the official narrative's enforcers would destroy it if they found it. They made the calculation that the desert was more reliable than compliance, that the ground would keep what the institution intended to burn. And they were right in a way that exceeded anything they could have anticipated, right across 16 centuries, right through the Council of Nicaea and the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Christianity and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the entire subsequent history of Western civilization, right up to a farmer near Alminia in 1978, putting a spade into the ground. They buried it anyway, with the specific and completely human courage of people who understood that truth has a better chance in the ground than in the fire, and who acted on that understanding at the cost of everything that acting on it required. There is a question that this entire story has been building toward. Not the historical question, not the theological question, the question that belongs to your life, right now. In the specific and concrete reality of the specific and concrete life you are actually living. The question is this: if the person you trusted most, the person whose judgment you believed in completely, whose understanding of the situation was deeper than your own, whose request carried the full weight of everything that person meant to you, if that person asked you to do the thing that would make you the villain of the story, would you do it? Not the villain in a minor sense, the villain in the permanent and total sense, the person whose name became the definition of the worst thing a human being can do to another human being. The person whose act was recorded in the founding story of a civilization and transmitted across 20 centuries as the ultimate example of what betrayal looks like and what betrayal costs. Would you say yes? Most people, when they encounter this question honestly, discover that the answer they want to give and the answer that the question actually produces are not the same. We want to say yes. We want to believe that our loyalty to the people we love most is complete enough and strong enough to survive the cost that the Gospel of Judas describes Judas paying. We want to believe that we are capable of the specific and extraordinary act of doing the right thing when the right thing is invisible from the outside, when everyone who observes what we are doing will see only the worst version of it, when the full context that would make our action comprehensible is the one piece of information that the situation requires us to withhold. But when we sit with the question honestly, with the specific and unglamorous honesty that Marcus Aurelius brought to the wax tablet every night in the cold tent on the Danube frontier, most of us discover that our loyalty has a limit, that what we actually value when we are required to choose between our reputation and our love, between how we appear and what we know, between the official version of our actions and the actual version, is not always what we said we valued when the choice was theoretical and the cost was abstract. This is not a condemnation, it is an observation. The observation that the gap between who we perform ourselves to be and who we actually are, the gap that this entire series has been examining from Marcus Aurelius to Commodus to Caligula, does not disappear when the question becomes religious rather than political, does not become easier because the context is ancient rather than contemporary. The gap is still there. In your life, right now, in the specific and private and completely real distance between the loyalty you perform and the loyalty you would actually demonstrate if the demonstration required what Judas's demonstration required. between the courage you claim and the courage that would survive the specific test that the Gospel of Judas describes. Between the love you say you have for the people who matter most to you and the love that would remain operational when demonstrating it made you permanently unrecognizable to everyone who did not have access to the full context. Judas had the full context, had received it directly from the person whose request he was honoring, had understood with the specific and clear understanding that the Gospel of Judas describes as the quality that made him different from the other disciples. What the act he was performing actually was, and what it actually cost, and what it was actually for. And he did it anyway, walked into the full weight of a condemnation that he knew was coming, that he knew would be permanent, that he knew would attach itself to his name and travel across every subsequent generation of a civilization that would never have access to the conversation that preceded the act. He did it with his eyes open. That is the detail that the Gospel of Judas adds to the story that the canonical account removed. Not the act itself, the canonical account preserves the act, but the understanding with which the act was performed. The full and clear and chosen understanding of someone who was not deceived or corrupted or motivated by 30 pieces of silver, but was simply honoring at enormous and permanent personal cost a request made by the person he loved most in the world. That is the mirror, not the theological mirror of a debate about Gnostic Christianity versus canonical orthodoxy, but the human mirror, the completely personal and completely uncomfortable mirror of a question that belongs to every life that contains any meaningful gap between the loyalty it performs and the loyalty it would actually demonstrate when the demonstration is real and the cost is permanent, and the official version of what you are doing will never contain the full context that would make it comprehensible. Marcus Aurelius chose the work every night, not perfectly, not without the daily temptation to accommodate the easier version of himself that circumstances were always offering, but persistently, with the specific and unglamorous consistency of a man who understood that the gap required daily attention and daily recommitment and the daily willingness to look at what was actually there rather than what was more comfortable to see. Judas, in the gospel that was buried for 16 centuries, chose the love. At the cost of the name, at the cost of every subsequent generation's understanding of who he was and what he did and why. At the cost of becoming, in the official version of the story that the institution needed to tell, the ultimate symbol of the worst thing a human being can do. The mirror is here. It has been here for 2,000 years, buried. For 16 centuries of them, available for the last few decades to anyone willing to look. The question it asks is not historical. It is not theological. It is about you, about the gap, about what you would do if the right thing and the thing that would be understood as the right thing were not the same thing, about whether the love you carry is the kind that survives being misunderstood, about whether you are capable, in the specific and daily and unglamorous way that genuine courage operates, of doing what you know is right when what you know is right is invisible from the outside. That is the question the desert preserved. That is what the limestone box contained. That is what the communities of early Christians decided was worth the risk of burial rather than the certainty of fire. Not a theological argument, a mirror. And the only question that matters is whether you are willing to look into it. You made it to the end. Not everyone does. Most people consume content the way they consume everything else, quickly, partially, always half somewhere else. You stayed through all of it, through the Council of Nicaea and the Egyptian desert and the bank vault in New York and the document that said Judas was asked and said yes. You stayed. And if something in this story landed, if at any point you felt the specific weight of a 2,000-year-old question arriving in your actual present life, then what you felt was real. So before you go, 3 things. First, Go to the comments right now and write, "I would have buried it too." Not as a theological statement, as a human one, as the acknowledgement of a person who has just spent time with a story about the cost of preserving what the institution intended to erase, and who recognizes in that cost something from their own experience of choosing between the official version and the actual one. Write it. I would have buried it too. It is 5 words. It is also, if you mean them, the beginning of the only honest relationship with this story that the story deserves. Second, hit the like button right now, not out of habit, because every like on this video is one more person who will encounter the question that 17 centuries of institutional power spent enormous resources preventing people from encountering. Because depth has value, because content that takes the buried question seriously, that trusts the audience to sit with the full weight of what the historical record actually contains, deserves to reach more people. Hit it now. Third, if you are not yet subscribed to Mindmasters Academy, subscribe right now and activate the bell. Because what is being built here is the only series that connects Marcus Aurelius to Commodus, to Caligula, to Judas, in a single unbroken conversation about power, narrative, and the gap between the official version of history and what actually happened. The series only makes complete sense to the people who follow it from the beginning. And what comes after Judas is already waiting. The next buried truth, the next figure that history condemned for reasons that history's authors needed rather than reasons that the evidence supports. The next document that someone decided was worth the risk of preservation rather than the certainty of fire. Subscribe, activate the bell, stay for what comes next, because the next video, the one that is on the screen right now, waiting for you to click it, takes everything this series has built and applies it to the figure whose story contains the most direct and most personally relevant mirror that the entire Western tradition has produced. The figure whose name you know, whose story you think you know, and whose actual story, the one that the official version required to be simplified into a symbol rather than examined as a life, is going to ask of you the same question that the Gospel of Judas asked, but closer. In a context that removes every protective distance that ancient history provides. Click the next video. It is on the screen right now. See you on the other side.